in 1959, I remember reading the story of two young priests in the Diocese of Mobile, Alabama, a Father David Sullivan and a Father Joe Jennings. And what they were trying to do, according to their writings, was to come up with a Catholic theology for the Protestant idea of tithing, which was very popular in the South at that particular time. Now, one of the things I noticed in their writing was that there was tremendous stress on the fact that people are looking for standards in life. The type of home they live in, the type of education for their children, and the various ways that they live. So if we're looking for standards in life, we also must be looking for standards in a relationship with God. Now, in the early 60s, whenever I began to come up with this concept, it was mainly about tithing. And I noticed that once you mentioned that in the church, you lost over 50% of the audience right away, So they decided, that there must be something more to this whole idea of building a relationship with God. So that's whenever I came up with the idea that all of us have a certain amount of time in this world, and all of us have a certain amount of talents. And how do we use those then, since they're all gifts to us from God? For example, the average person spends 25,000 days here on this earth. And whenever God calls us to himself, we must account for how did we spend that time while we're here on this earth. And I stress the time because everybody has time. Although most people will say, well, I don't really have time. See, because we're so busy with many things that we don't really look at really what's important in this life at all whatsoever. One of the things I've always stressed was how much time, for example, do husbands and wives give each other at home. As the marriage encounter people call it quality time, right? And I think it's very, very important that they let each other know how much they need each other, how much they love each other, how much they care for each other. And the same thing with regard to the children. How much time do they spend with their children? Because after all, the children learn by example, and they're imitators. So how much time do they give with them? Because time to a little child is love. That they would prefer that rather than a whole series of toys or anything else like that. See? Like one of the things I remember reading, this was probably 25 years ago, was a survey done at the University of Iowa by the sociology department. And they wrote to 100 homes in the area, and they wrote to the dads to mark down for 1 week how much time did they spend with each child. The reply came back that they spent an average of 17 minutes with each child during that week. Now, what they didn't know was they also wrote to all their mothers, but they didn't tell the fathers, and asked them to keep careful check of the amount of time that dad did spend with each kid during that week. And the average came back 17 again, but it was 17 seconds. So this really, is something we don't sometimes think about. Because we, most of the time, especially for little kids, they're still in bed by the time dad leaves for work, and by the time he comes home, they're ready for bed. So he doesn't have much time, except on weekends. But sometimes he needs the weekend for himself. So after we find out then how much time we have, we stress the fact, that we have time to watch TV, we have time to read the newspapers, we have time to read magazines, we have time to talk on the phone, we have time probably to do some recreation, so we have time for all these things. Well, where does God come in? Do we have time for God at home? A lot of people think, well, they don't have talent because they're thinking about doing something or other like that, But we have talents in all ways. And everybody has an education has talents because they can, very simple talents, for example, they can call a neighbor, they can visit with a sick person, they can, counsel someone that needs counseling, they can really and truly work with handicapped, but they can also pray. And they can all do these things, you know, all on their own time. So that it doesn't have to be all organized or anything else like that in order to do it. Now, and this is a gift that really God has given us. As St. Peter tells us, you know, put all your gifts at the service of others. That's what he's telling us, you know. And I mean, of course, Christ was very severe whenever we didn't use our talents. He said, like, you know, we can neither be hot nor cold. We must really be hot at all times. We can't be in between at all. Because otherwise, he said, I begin to, well, he says a terrible thing, vomit you out of my mouth. You know, and he tells us you don't light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. You put it on a mountain top where it can be really useful to really light the whole place so that we can travel in safety. Or again, the famous parable of the fig tree, you know, where it mentions about Jesus and the apostles being hungry, walking along the road, and they spy this fig tree. So they go over to the fig tree, but there's no fruit on it. Now, what does the Son of God do? He says, never again will you produce fruit. And the tree withered in his sight of them all. So we see, like, you know, were we like God really to say that to us now, you see, whenever we don't produce fruit along the line in our lives, because what we're doing is we're building up that individual relationship with regard to Almighty God. And this is where the church becomes very important, you see, because each of us have that obligation to build a personal relationship with God, because we stand alone on Judgment Day. Right? But then the church becomes very important because that's where we experience Christ, in the Mass and in the Eucharist, and in the other sacraments. So that really the people then go to church because they want to go, because of the need of Christ. Not because they're told by the church, you have to go. There's no have to at all. But they, in order to build that relationship, feel their need to go. And this is why, over the years, we'd always had a splendid turnout here in this parish and also in the diocese, really, whenever we introduced stewardship to them. So stewardship really, you know, is a way of life. And it's not a program. It's a process. And this is the biggest mistake that a lot of people think it is, because we're so used with programs. See, program starts and ends. Stewardship way of life goes on forever. We are expected to draw closer to God through our practice, really, of using that time and talent, and eventually our treasure too. Because that's one of the things sometimes we forget, you know. We forget, you know, that the treasure that we accumulate is accumulated through the help of God. Because if God didn't give us the time, if He didn't give us the energy, if He didn't give us the talent, what would we accumulate? Nothing. So it actually, those possessions, actually, we never own them. We know that. Because whenever God calls us, what do we do with them? We have to leave them for others. See, whenever we're born into the world, we're born with nothing material. So whenever we return to God, we have to leave all material gifts behind us. I mean, you never seen a hearse going to the cemetery, like, you know, with a U-Haul behind it yet. Although they tell us out in Los Angeles, you know, outside of Forest Lawn, there's a savings and loan there, see, with a sign on it. You can't take it with you, but you can keep it close, you know. And we begin to wonder, like, you know, is this how we feel about these things, you know? And one of our problems as human beings is, you know, we never have enough of these material gifts at all, you know. We, right now, like, you know, in the last 15 to 20 years, a new industry has grown up in most cities in this country, which we call storage places. And they're all over every city. And what do we store in them? We store in them things we don't have room for in our own homes. And what is it most of the time? Things we'll never use and junk. So here we're paying good money to store junk. Now, does this make sense to us at all? It really doesn't at all whatsoever, you see. So we need to do a little thinking along the line, you know. God will always provide for us enough, and that's what he has told us. He tells us, for example, that not even a sparrow falls from the heavens without his heavenly Father knowing it. The only time we're really happy in this life is whenever we have a good relationship with God. Because that's the way God made us. He wants us all in heaven with him. So he wants us all to build that relationship. He wants us always then to have no guilt feelings with regard to him. And whenever we have that relationship with God, then we can have that relationship with one another. So this is what's really important in all of our lives, that we can build that relationship with God. You know, since the beginning of time, human beings have tried to come up with ideas to bring them happiness. For some it was power, for some it was drugs, for some it was alcohol, some it was sex. None of these things have really satisfied people. They didn't last for any length of time, simply because God made us all in that very same way. He gave us all an intelligence to think with. He gave us a will to pass judgment with, but he threw in a conscience. And that conscience tells us from the time we're little kids our relationship with God. And if we feel guilty with regard to doing something wrong in relationship with God, well, we don't feel right. We're unhappy. So we've got to get rid of that guilt. Right? And we get rid of that, like, you know, through the sacrament of reconciliation with, again, Christ's gift to us, that he brought to us. So all these, Christ, you see, is a center of really what a stewardship way of life is all about. That this is really a spiritual process, that it's just not a program that you can just throw in and throw out. It's like an overcoat, put it on whenever you need it and take it off whenever you don't. Once you adopt the stewardship way of life, it's a way for life, and you continue it all of your life. Right? And that's the one thing you'll experience with regard to people who really and truly practice this way of life for a year. They never quit it. They always hold on to it, see? Which is completely different from any program or anything else like that you get. But the problem is too, you know, as you mentioned night Sunday, sometimes it appears too simple. And I think that's what confuses some of the clergy, see? Because it's all biblically based. I mean, 19 of the major parables of Christ relate directly to stewardship. When the bishops were forming it, for bringing out their pastoral on stewardship, back in 1992, they did not want to call it stewardship. They wanted to call it a disciple's response. Now, the reason being was that they felt that stewardship meant money. And it convinced them at the time was, no, stewardship is a biblical word. So let's explain what a steward really is and plant the seed there, like, you know. And then the secondary column was a disciple's response. So this is where they drew this up, and Archbishop Murphy, who's gone to his eternal reward now, you know, we really miss the man. He headed up the bishops' committee on it. And as he said, he was convinced more and more as they went on to their study of really the spiritual element and the spiritual substance that is really to this whole concept of stewardship. And up until then, like, he didn't realize like that the spiritual dimension of it at all. That was more or less, the idea was, again, getting back to the money. But Christ never is talking about being stewards, never talked about raising money. See, there's one parable, of course, with regard to the talents, whereby about the use of money he's talking about, like, you know, and we can see, like, you see how that being the good steward of how the two who received the 5 and the 3 talents, that they expanded them to get 5 more and 3 more, was the one who got the 1. So he became selfish with it, and he was afraid of the man. They were afraid and they hid it, like, you know. So this was their talent that they hid, like, you see. And the Christ, who's a judge, what did he say? Get out of my sight, you lazy lout. and take the one from and give it to the one who is the most. See, I wonder, does God say that to us too sometimes, you know, if we don't use what our talents that we have? See? So these are the things you explain to people. And people understand the Bible once it's explained to them. You know, once these different stories are put together. And there's so many of those stewardship stories in there that they realize that stewardship is a lot more than money. Stewardship is life. It's a way of life. But it's a thanksgiving way of life. The obligation of thanking God for everything.